A millionaire visits his son's grave, only to find two young black orphaned girls crying there. They look up, heartbroken, and say just two words that leave him shattered. Who are these girls? And what connection did they have to his son? This life-changing story reveals secrets of family, redemption, and the unexpected ways love finds us. Don't miss this unforgettable journey of discovery and healing. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun crept through the heavy silk curtains of Henry Caldwell's master bedroom, painting golden stripes across the polished hardwood floor. His eyes opened precisely at 6:30, just as they had every day for the past 30 years. The king-sized bed felt too large, too empty, like everything else in the mansion. Henry's feet touched the plush carpet, and he moved through his morning routine with mechanical precision. The marble bathroom echoed with every movement. The running water, the click of his electric toothbrush, the soft thud of his toiletry items being set down. Each sound seemed to emphasize the crushing silence that filled the rest of the house. He adjusted his silk tie in the full-length mirror, smoothing non-existent wrinkles from his tailored charcoal suit. Perfect, pristine, proper, and completely alone. The hallway stretched before him like a museum corridor as he made his way downstairs. Original paintings hung in gilded frames, their value obvious to anyone with an eye for fine art. Crystal vases stood on antique tables, catching the morning light and scattering tiny rainbows across the walls. His footsteps echoed against the marble floor, each step highlighting the emptiness around him. Halfway down the grand staircase, he caught sight of it, the portrait he could never bring himself to remove. Michael's gentle smile looked down at him from the massive oil painting, his son's kind eyes seeming to follow him as he passed. Henry's steps quickened, his jaw tightening as he turned his head away. The pain was still too raw, too real, even after all this time. The dining room was a study in unnecessary grandeur. A mahogany table that could seat 20 stretched before him, yet only one place was set, at the head of the table where Henry always sat. Crystal glasses caught the morning light, and fine bone china waited to serve a solitary diner. Mrs. Eleanor Grant appeared silently at his elbow, her gray hair neatly pinned back, her black dress pressed to perfection. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said quietly, placing a silver dome-covered plate before him. "I've prepared your usual breakfast." Henry gave a slight nod, barely registering her presence. She lifted the dome to reveal perfectly poached eggs on whole-grain toast, with a side of fresh fruit arranged just so. Steam rose from the cup of coffee she poured, Colombian roast, black just as he preferred it. But Henry merely stared at the plate, his fork untouched. His mind wandered to Sunday breakfasts from years ago, when Michael would fill this room with his laughter and endless chatter about his latest charitable project. How many times had Henry dismissed those conversations, too focused on quarterly reports and business meetings? Mrs. Grant stood quietly by the sideboard, her hands clasped in front of her, watching as the eggs grew cold and the coffee stopped steaming. She'd served the Caldwell family for over 2 decades, had watched Michael grow up, had seen the growing distance between father and son. Now she witnessed Henry's daily ritual of silence and regret, maintaining her professional distance even as concern flickered in her eyes. "Will there be anything else, sir?" she finally asked, her voice barely disturbing the heavy silence. Henry lifted his coffee cup more out of habit than desire and shook his head slightly. The morning paper lay unopened beside his plate, its headlines irrelevant to the memories that haunted him. Through the tall dining room windows, sunlight streamed in, illuminating the fine particles of dust dancing in the air, beautiful, yet untouchable, much like everything else in Henry Caldwell's solitary world. After his untouched breakfast, Henry found himself standing before a door he rarely opened. Michael's bedroom remained exactly as it had been, preserved like a museum exhibit. His trembling hand hesitated on the brass doorknob before finally turning it. The scent hit him first, a lingering trace of Michael's cologne mixed with the mustiness of an unused room. Dust motes danced in the streams of sunlight filtering through the half-drawn curtains. Henry's expensive leather shoes sank into the thick carpet as he took tentative steps into this shrine to his son's life. Trophies lined the shelves, their golden surfaces dulled by a thin layer of dust. Henry approached them slowly, reading inscriptions he'd never bothered to examine before. Volunteer of the Year, Community Service Excellence, Youth Leadership Award. Each trophy told a story of a young man Henry had barely known, too consumed by his own ambitions to notice his son's achievements. Sports memorabilia covered one wall, not of professional teams, but of the local youth league Michael had coached. Photos showed him surrounded by smiling children, his arm around their shoulders, teaching them how to hold a bat or throw a ball. Henry's throat tightened. He'd never attended a single one of those games, always claiming he had important meetings. On Michael's desk, more framed photographs captured moments of his son's life. Michael at his college graduation, proudly holding his diploma. Michael at the opening of a youth center he'd helped establish. Michael serving meals at a homeless shelter. Each image revealed a side of his son that Henry had dismissed as youthful idealism, not understanding that these pursuits had defined Michael's character. Among these photographs, one stood out. Henry picked it up, his hands shaking slightly. The silver frame held a snapshot from years ago. Henry and Michael at the beach, both wearing matching baseball caps. Michael couldn't have been more than 7. They were building a sandcastle together, both laughing as waves threatened their creation. Henry remembered that day with painful clarity, one of the few times he'd put aside work to spend time with his son. His finger traced the glass over Michael's smiling face. The boy in the photo looked at his father with pure adoration. Before years of missed dinners, forgotten school events, and arguments about practical career choices had erected walls between them. The weight of regret pressed against Henry's chest, making it hard to breathe. The room suddenly felt too small, too filled with evidence of his failures as a father. The photos seemed to stare at him accusingly, each one a reminder of moments he'd chosen to miss, of conversations he'd refused to have, of a relationship he'd allowed to wither. Unable to bear it any longer, Henry set the beach photo down with unsteady hands. He turned abruptly, nearly knocking over a stack of volunteer certificates on his way to the door. His composed facade cracked as he practically fled the room, pulling the door shut behind him with more force than necessary. The sound echoed through the empty hallway, a final punctuation mark to another failed attempt at confronting his grief. Henry leaned against the closed door, his breathing ragged, his perfectly knotted tie suddenly feeling like a noose. The memories he'd tried so hard to keep at bay threatened to overwhelm him, but he fought them back, straightening his jacket with trembling hands. The autumn wind rustled through the cemetery's maple trees, scattering golden leaves across the meticulously maintained grounds. Henry Caldwell stood before his son's headstone, a single white rose clutched in his hand. The polished granite marker read, "Michael James Caldwell, beloved son and friend to many." Today would have been Michael's 35th birthday. Henry placed the rose carefully at the base of the headstone, his fingers lingering on the cold stone. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cemetery, and the air held the crisp bite of early October. He straightened his dark wool coat, trying to maintain his composure even here, alone with his grief. The sound of quiet footsteps on grass caught his attention. Henry stepped back, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, as 2 young girls approached Michael's grave. The older one, perhaps 13 or 14, held the hand of her younger sister, who couldn't have been more than 8. Both wore simple, well-worn coats that spoke of modest means. The older girl had long brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her expression carried a maturity beyond her years. The younger one clutched a small bunch of wildflowers, her cheeks pink from the morning chill. They moved with purpose, clearly familiar with the path to Michael's grave. "Look, Emma," the younger girl whispered, pointing at the white rose. "Someone else remembered his birthday too." The older girl, Emma, squeezed her sister's hand. "Of course they did, Zoe. Mr. Michael was special to lots of people." Henry watched, puzzled, as Zoe carefully arranged her wildflowers next to his rose. The girls stood quietly for a moment, and then Zoe spoke again, her voice small but clear in the morning stillness. "I miss his stories," she said. "Remember how he used to make funny voices for all the characters?" Emma nodded, wiping quickly at her eyes. And how he always brought you hot chocolate when you were in the hospital? Even when it wasn't visiting hours, he'd convince the nurses to let him in. Henry's breath caught in his throat. These girls had known his son, known him well enough to visit his grave on his birthday, to speak of him with such fondness. He found himself leaning forward slightly, straining to hear more about this side of Michael he'd never known. He helped me with my math homework, Emma continued, her voice soft with memory. Said everyone deserves a chance to learn no matter what. She straightened Zoe's scarf with careful hands. And he made sure you got your medicine when Aunt Sarah couldn't afford it. The girls stood in silence for another moment, their heads bowed. Then, in unison, they whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Michael," their words carrying clearly to where Henry stood. As they turned to leave, Zoe leaning against her sister's side, Henry remained frozen behind the oak tree. His mind whirled with questions. Who were these girls? How had they known Michael? What other acts of kindness had his son performed that he'd never known about? He watched their retreating figures, noting how the older girl supported her sister, how their well-worn clothes spoke of financial struggles, how they carried themselves with quiet dignity despite their apparent hardships. The mystery of their connection to Michael tugged at him, demanding answers he didn't have. Henry watched the two girls make their way down the winding cemetery path, their figures growing smaller against the autumn landscape. His hand gripped the rough bark of the oak tree as he wrestled with the urge to run after them. Questions burned in his mind, but something held him back, perhaps the fear of disturbing the peaceful moment they'd shared at Michael's grave. When the girls disappeared around a bend in the path, Henry emerged from behind the tree. His polished leather shoes crunched on fallen leaves as he walked briskly toward the cemetery office, a small brick building near the entrance gates. The morning air had grown colder and he pulled his wool coat tighter around himself. Mr. Samuel Hayes, the cemetery caretaker, was sweeping leaves from the office steps when Henry approached. The older man's weathered face crinkled into a polite smile as he recognized the wealthy visitor. "Mr. Caldwell," Samuel said, leaning his broom against the railing. "I noticed you were here early today. Michael's birthday, isn't it?" Henry nodded curtly. "Yes, Mr. Hayes, I was wondering if you might help me with something." He described the two girls, their approximate ages, their visit to Michael's grave. "Do you know who they are? Do they come here often?" Samuel removed his work cap, running a hand through his gray hair. "Can't say that I do, sir. I see all sorts of folks come through here, but I don't make it a habit to keep track. Though now that you mention it, I might have seen those girls before. Always respectful they are, never cause any trouble." Disappointment settled in Henry's chest. He thanked the caretaker and walked quickly to where his black Mercedes waited in the parking area. Thomas Reed, his driver of 15 years, stood at attention beside the car, his gray uniform pristine as always. "Thomas," Henry said as he approached, "the two girls who just left the cemetery, did you see which way they went?" "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, opening the car door. They headed east on foot toward the bus stop on Mason Street. Henry slid into the back seat, his mind racing. The leather upholstery creaked as he leaned forward. "Follow them, Thomas, discreetly." Thomas hesitated, his hand on the door handle. "Sir?" "They knew Michael," Henry explained, his voice tight with emotion. "They knew things about him I didn't know. I need to understand how." The driver's reflection in the rearview mirror showed his concern, but he nodded. "Of course, sir." He started the engine and slowly guided the car out of the parking area. As they drove, Henry stared out the tinted windows, scanning the sidewalks. His conscience nagged at him. Following two young girls felt wrong, intrusive. But the need to understand this hidden part of Michael's life overshadowed his misgivings. They spotted the girls waiting at the bus stop, Zoe leaning against her sister, Emma's arm protectively around her shoulders. Thomas kept a reasonable distance, pulling into a convenience store parking lot where they could observe without being obvious. "Sir?" Thomas said quietly. "Are you sure about this?" Henry watched the sisters through the window, noting how the younger one seemed tired, how the older one supported her with obvious care. "No," he admitted, "but I need answers, Thomas. I need to know who they are and why my son meant so much to them." The bus arrived and the girls boarded. Thomas pulled the Mercedes back onto the street, maintaining a careful distance behind the public transport as it moved through the city streets. The Mercedes pulled into the circular driveway of the Caldwell mansion as evening shadows lengthened across the manicured lawn. Thomas shifted the car into park and turned to face Henry in the back seat. "I've confirmed where they live, sir," Thomas reported, his voice carrying a note of hesitation. "It's the Oakwood Heights area, specifically the apartment complex on Cedar Street." Henry's brow furrowed. Oakwood Heights was one of the city's struggling neighborhoods, a far cry from the pristine streets surrounding his estate. "Tell me more." "They live with their aunt, Clara Johnson. The apartment building is—" Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's seen better days, sir. Broken windows in the lobby, graffiti on the walls, but their unit seemed well kept, at least from what I could observe." Henry nodded slowly, processing this information. "Thank you, Thomas. That will be all for today." Inside his home office, Henry pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Margaret, could you come in, please?" Margaret Thompson entered moments later, her tablet already in hand. At 58, she'd been Henry's personal assistant for over 2 decades, and her efficiency was legendary among the staff. "I need information on a family," Henry said, drumming his fingers on his mahogany desk. "The Johnsons. They live in Oakwood Heights. 2 girls and their aunt. Clara Johnson is the aunt's name." Margaret's fingers moved swiftly across her tablet. "I'll start right away, Mr. Caldwell. Any specific information you're looking for?" "Everything," Henry replied. "Background, financial situation, connection to—" He swallowed hard. "Connection to Michael." "I'll have it for you first thing tomorrow morning," Margaret assured him. The next day, Margaret's findings left Henry stunned in his leather chair. She stood before his desk, reading from her tablet. "Emma and Zoe Johnson lost their parents in a car accident 3 years ago," Margaret began. "They've been living with their Aunt Clara ever since. But here's what's interesting. Michael was their mentor through the city youth program." Henry's head snapped up. "What?" "According to the program records, Michael worked with both girls for 2 years before his passing. He helped Emma with college applications and tutored Zoe in mathematics." Margaret's voice softened. "There are several photos of them together at program events." Henry's throat tightened. "Show me." Margaret turned her tablet around. There was Michael, his son, smiling broadly with his arm around Emma's shoulders at what appeared to be a science fair. Another photo showed him helping Zoe with homework at a library table. His son looked so alive, so engaged, so different from the distant young man Henry had known in recent years. "There's more," Margaret continued. "Michael made regular donations to a medical fund for Zoe. She has a heart condition that requires ongoing treatment. The donations stopped after his—" She cleared her throat. "After his passing." Henry stared at the photos, his vision blurring. Here was proof of a side of Michael he'd never known, a caring mentor, a positive influence in these girls' lives. While Henry had been focused on grooming his son to take over the family business, Michael had been quietly making a real difference in the world. "Thank you, Margaret," he said quietly. "Please email me all the information you've gathered." After Margaret left, Henry sat alone in his office, the weight of these revelations pressing down on him. The girls whispered "thank you" at Michael's grave now made perfect sense. His son had been their guardian angel, and Henry had never known. Henry sat in his leather chair staring at the email Margaret had sent him. The photos of Michael with Emma and Zoe filled his computer screen, each one a testament to a life he'd failed to understand. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly as he contemplated drafting an email to the youth program coordinator about the girls. The weight of indecision pressed heavily on his shoulders. The setting sun cast long shadows across his study, reminding him of countless evenings spent in this very room, choosing work over family. The amber light caught the edge of Michael's framed law school diploma on the wall, a reminder of expectations never fulfilled. He closed his eyes, and a memory surfaced, sharp and painful. "Dad, if you'd just listen for a minute," Michael said, pushing his plate away during one of their rare family dinners 2 years ago. The dining room's chandelier cast a harsh light on his son's frustrated expression. The untouched food grew cold between them, a metaphor for their cooling relationship. The youth program is making real changes in these kids' lives. Henry barely glanced up from his phone, his thumb scrolling through endless emails. That's nice, son, but we need to discuss the Thompson merger. The board meeting is tomorrow. There's more to life than mergers and acquisitions, Michael insisted, his voice rising. His hands clenched into fists on the table, knuckles white with tension. These kids need mentors, guidance. Some of them have incredible potential, but no opportunities. Henry set his phone down, fixing his son with a stern look that had cowed many business opponents over the years. And what about your potential? Your opportunities? I've built this company from the ground up, prepared it for you to take over someday. But you're too busy playing social worker to focus on what really matters. What really matters? Michael stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. Making more money? Adding another zero to our bank account? These kids matter, Dad. Their futures matter. You're being naive, Henry replied coldly, his words carrying the weight of decades of business experience. Charity is fine as a hobby, but it's not a career, not for a Caldwell. Michael's face hardened, a mirror of his father's own stubborn expression. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe being a Caldwell isn't what I want to be. He stormed out of the dining room, leaving Henry alone with his phone and his spreadsheets. The echo of his footsteps faded down the hallway. It was one of their last conversations before the accident. Back in the present, Henry closed his laptop with a decisive click that seemed to echo in the empty study. No, he couldn't get involved with Emma and Zoe. Opening that door would mean confronting too many painful truths, too many regrets. It would mean admitting that Michael had seen something valuable that Henry had dismissed, something that now haunted his conscience. He walked to the window, watching as darkness settled over his perfectly manicured grounds. A groundskeeper was finishing up for the day, his small figure a reminder of all the working-class people Henry had spent his life keeping at arm's length. The girls had their aunt, he reasoned. They'd managed this long without his help. Getting involved now would only complicate things, stir up memories better left undisturbed. I'm sorry, Michael, he whispered to the empty room, his breath fogging the window glass. But I can't do this. Henry returned to his desk and deleted Margaret's email, along with the photos of his son's other life, the life he'd never bothered to understand. The familiar ache of loss settled in his chest as he watched the images disappear. He had a company to run, meetings to attend, deals to close. That was his world, and he would stick to what he knew best, even if it meant continuing to live with his regrets. Henry sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, surrounded by the usual buzz of corporate activity. Charts and projections filled the screen behind him, but his mind kept drifting to the two girls at the cemetery. Richard Bennett's sharp voice cut through his thoughts. Mr. Caldwell? The Q3 projections? Richard's tone carried a hint of irritation. His perfectly pressed suit and severe expression matched his reputation as the board's most demanding member. Henry blinked, focusing on the spreadsheet in front of him. Yes, of course. He cleared his throat, shuffling through papers he hadn't really been reading. The projections show. Perhaps we should take a brief recess, Richard suggested, his words clipped. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. During the break, Richard cornered Henry by the water cooler. Henry, what's going on? This isn't like you. The merger with Pacific Tech needs your full attention. I assure you, Richard, everything is under control, Henry replied stiffly, though the words felt hollow even to him. When Henry finally returned to his office that afternoon, a cardboard box waited on his desk. Michael Caldwell, Personal Effects, was written in black marker on the side. His assistant Margaret had left a note explaining that the company had finally cleared out Michael's old office. Henry's hands trembled slightly as he opened the box. Inside were the usual items: a coffee mug, some framed photos, a few books. But beneath these lay a leather-bound notebook, its pages worn with use. Henry recognized it as the journal he'd given Michael for his last birthday, an expensive gift chosen by his assistant. Settling into his chair, Henry opened the notebook. Michael's familiar handwriting filled the pages with more than just business notes. There were observations, thoughts, and most intriguingly, entries about two young girls named Emma and Zoe Johnson. Met with Emma and Zoe today, one entry read. Emma's showing real promise in her studies. She reminds me of myself at that age, driven, but needing guidance. Zoe's health issues are concerning, but her spirit remains unbreakable. Must look into better healthcare options for them. Another entry caught his eye. Emma asked about college today. She's worried about leaving Zoe, but she has so much potential. These girls deserve every chance at success. Dad would probably say I'm wasting my time, but he's wrong. Some investments can't be measured in dollars and cents. Henry's throat tightened as he read entry after entry. Each page revealed more about his son's secret life of mentorship and caring. Michael had been building something meaningful, something Henry had dismissed as frivolous. The girls weren't just random acquaintances. They had been important to Michael, part of a purpose Henry had never bothered to understand. He found himself lingering over details about Emma's academic achievements and Zoe's medical challenges. Michael had documented their struggles and triumphs with the same attention to detail that Henry applied to business reports. But unlike cold financial data, these pages pulsed with life and compassion. The more Henry read, the more his earlier resolution to stay uninvolved began to crumble. These weren't just words on a page. They were windows into his son's heart, into the person Michael had become while Henry wasn't watching. The Riverside Community Center stood in stark contrast to the gleaming corporate towers Henry usually frequented. Paint peeled from its weathered walls, and a rusty chain-link fence surrounded a modest playground. His Mercedes looked out of place in the cracked parking lot. Henry straightened his tie, more a nervous habit than necessity, before pushing open the heavy metal door. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating walls covered with children's artwork and community announcements. The linoleum floor showed years of wear from countless footsteps. A woman in her 50s looked up from the front desk, her warm brown eyes widening in recognition. "Mr. Caldwell?" She stood, smoothing her simple cotton dress. "I'm Linda Morales, the center's director. I never expected to see you here." "Mrs. Morales." Henry nodded stiffly. "I understand my son Michael volunteered here." Linda's face softened at Michael's name. "Please come to my office." She led him down a narrow hallway, past rooms filled with the sounds of children's laughter and tutoring sessions. Her office was small but welcoming, with plants on the windowsill and photos covering one wall. Henry's eyes were drawn to a particular picture: Michael surrounded by smiling children, including two familiar faces, Emma and Zoe Johnson. "Michael was here 3 times a week," Linda said, settling into her chair. "Sometimes more. He'd help with homework, organize field trips, even coached our basketball team." She gestured to a trophy on a shelf. "The kids called him Mr. M." Henry's throat tightened. "Mr. M," he repeated softly. He was especially devoted to Emma and Zoe Johnson. Linda watched Henry's reaction carefully. When their parents died in that car accident, Michael became like a big brother to them. He saw something special in Emma, her determination to succeed despite everything, and Zoe. Linda smiled. "That girl has the sweetest heart, even with all her health challenges." "I never knew," Henry admitted, his voice rough, "about any of this." Linda nodded, reaching for a photo album. "Here." She opened it to show Michael helping a group of children plant a small garden. "He started our community garden project. Said everyone deserves fresh vegetables, not just people who can afford fancy grocery stores." Page after page showed Michael's life at the center, teaching a young boy to read, painting walls during renovation, serving Thanksgiving dinner to elderly residents. In each photo, his smile was genuine, his eyes alive with purpose. "The last project he was working on," Linda continued, "was setting up a scholarship fund for our kids. He believed education could break the cycle of poverty." She paused, meeting Henry's eyes. "He was trying to make real change here, Mr. Caldwell. Not just throwing money at problems, but getting involved, understanding people's struggles." Henry's chest felt heavy. He'd always measured success in profit margins and market share. But here, In this humble office, surrounded by evidence of his son's true legacy, those measures seemed hollow. "The kids still talk about him," Linda said softly. "They miss him terribly. We all do." She touched a photo of Michael surrounded by his basketball team. "He wasn't just a volunteer, Mr. Caldwell. He was family." The word family hit Henry like a physical blow. While he'd been building his business empire, Michael had built something far more valuable: genuine connections with people who needed him. Henry had never felt more humbled or more aware of what he'd failed to see in his own son. As Linda finished speaking, voices drifted in from the hallway. Henry turned toward the door just as two girls appeared, the same ones he'd seen at the cemetery. The younger one, Zoe, clutched a worn backpack to her chest, while Emma, the older sister, instinctively stepped slightly in front of her. "Oh!" Zoe's eyes went wide with recognition. "You're the man from—" Emma squeezed her sister's hand, cutting her off. Her face remained carefully neutral as she studied Henry. Linda rose from her desk, her warm smile bridging the awkward silence. "Emma, Zoe, this is Mr. Caldwell. He's Michael's father." "Michael's dad?" Zoe whispered, her grip on her backpack loosening slightly. Henry cleared his throat. "Yes, I saw you both at the cemetery last week." Emma's posture remained protective, but her expression softened slightly. "We visit every week. Michael was important to us." Linda gestured to the chairs in her office. "Why don't we all sit down? I was just showing Mr. Caldwell some photos of Michael's time here." The girls settled into the chairs, Zoe scooting hers closer to Emma's. Henry noticed the worn edges of their clothes, the scuffed shoes, details that would have escaped his attention just weeks ago. "Michael helped me with math," Zoe offered suddenly, her voice small but clear. "He made it fun, like a game. He said I was getting really good at fractions." Emma's eyes grew distant. "He came to see us right after Mom died, brought us books and sat with us for hours, just talking or reading stories to Zoe when she couldn't sleep." She swallowed hard. He understood what it was like to lose someone. He told us about losing his mom when he was young. Henry's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. His late wife, Catherine, Michael had rarely spoken of her to him after her death. "He believed in us," Emma continued, gaining confidence. "When Aunt Clara couldn't afford my AP exam fees, Michael paid for them. He said education was the key to changing our lives." She met Henry's eyes directly. "He made us promise to never give up on our dreams, no matter how hard things got." Zoe pulled something from her backpack, a small, dog-eared book. "He gave me this on my birthday last year." She held it out to Henry. It was a collection of fairy tales, the cover worn from frequent reading. Inside, Michael's familiar handwriting read, "For Zoe, keep believing in magic. Love, Mr. M." Henry handled the book carefully as if it were made of glass. Each revelation about his son felt like uncovering a piece of a puzzle he hadn't known existed. "The last time we saw him," Emma said quietly, "he was excited about some new project. He said it would help kids like us have a real chance at college." Her voice wavered slightly. 2 days later, we heard about the accident. Linda placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. The girl's composure cracked just slightly, revealing the deep well of grief beneath. "He was the kindest person we ever knew," Zoe said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He made us feel like we mattered." Henry sat there surrounded by the evidence of his son's compassion, the photos on the walls, the worn fairy tale book, and these two girls whose lives Michael had touched so profoundly. In their stories, he began to see the man his son had become, the one he'd been too busy, too focused on business, to truly know. Henry sat in his leather armchair, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study. The manicured gardens below, once a source of pride, now seemed empty and artificial. His conversation with Emma and Zoe echoed in his mind, each detail revealing another facet of Michael he'd never known. "He made us feel like we mattered." Zoe's words cut through his carefully constructed walls. How many times had Michael tried to share his passion for helping others? How many times had Henry dismissed it as naive idealism? Mrs. Grant appeared with his evening tea, setting it carefully on the side table. "Will you be needing anything else, sir?" Henry barely heard her, lost in the memory of his last conversation with Michael. They'd argued about the community center, about Michael's insistence on spending time there instead of learning the family business. "That'll be all," he muttered. Mrs. Grant hesitated, then quietly withdrew. The stack of quarterly reports sat untouched on his desk. Henry pulled them closer, determined to focus. The numbers blurred before his eyes. Instead of profit margins, he saw Emma's protective stance over her sister. Instead of market projections, he remembered the worn fairy tale book Michael had given Zoe. His phone buzzed, another message from Richard Bennett about the upcoming board meeting. Henry ignored it. How had he raised a son capable of such kindness while being so blind to it himself? The sky darkened outside his windows. Henry's tea grew cold, untouched. He pulled out Michael's notebook again, running his fingers over the pages filled with his son's handwriting. Notes about Emma's college aspirations, Zoe's progress in math, plans for a scholarship program, all dreams cut short. Unable to sit still any longer, Henry grabbed his coat. Thomas was surprised to see him heading out so late, but knew better than to question it. The drive to the cemetery was quiet, streetlights casting intermittent shadows across Henry's troubled face. The cemetery was empty, peaceful under the rising moon. Henry's footsteps crunched on the gravel path as he made his way to Michael's grave. The white marble headstone gleamed softly in the darkness. "I didn't know you," Henry whispered, his voice rough. "I thought I did, but I was wrong." He touched the cold stone, tracing the letters of his son's name. "You were trying to show me something important, weren't you? And I was too stubborn to see it." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of nearby trees. Henry remembered Michael as a child, full of questions and wonder. When had he stopped listening to those questions? When had he decided that success could only be measured in dollars and cents? "Those girls," he continued, "they knew a side of you I never took the time to understand." His throat tightened. "You were their hero, and I was just your disappointed father." The admission hung heavy in the night air. Henry stood there, one hand still resting on the headstone, feeling the weight of years of missed opportunities and unspoken words. The next morning, Henry sat at his desk, crumpling yet another attempt at the perfect letter. 5 discarded drafts littered his normally pristine workspace, their wrinkled forms a testament to his struggle. He hadn't written a personal letter in years, preferring the efficiency of emails or having his assistant handle correspondence. The very act of putting pen to paper felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. Mrs. Grant appeared with fresh coffee, the familiar aroma filling his office. She noticed his furrowed brow and the growing pile of rejected letters. "Perhaps, sir, if you wrote from the heart, rather than the head," she suggested gently, her years of service giving her the confidence to speak freely. Henry glanced up, surprised by her suggestion and the simple wisdom in it. She quickly busied herself with straightening the room, adjusting the curtains and gathering the discarded papers. But her words stuck with him. Taking a fresh sheet of his personal stationery, the heavy cream paper embossed with his initials, he began again. "Dear Mrs. Johnson, my name is Henry Caldwell. I am Michael Caldwell's father. I recently learned of the connection between my late son and your nieces, Emma and Zoe. I would very much appreciate the opportunity to meet with you and discuss this relationship. I understand any hesitation you might have, but I assure you my intentions are purely to learn more about this aspect of my son's life. Please know that I respect your role as the girl's guardian and would defer to your wishes regarding any meeting arrangements. If you are willing, I would suggest meeting at a location of your choosing where you would feel most comfortable. Sincerely, Henry Caldwell." He read it over several times before carefully folding it into an envelope, smoothing each crease with deliberate attention. Rather than sending Thomas or having it delivered, Henry drove himself to their neighborhood in his silver Mercedes, feeling oddly conspicuous. The modest houses and small yards were a stark contrast to his estate, but he noticed signs of pride in the well-tended gardens and clean sidewalks. Children's bicycles leaned against porches and window boxes overflowed with cheerful petunias. 3 days later, a response arrived in a plain white envelope. Henry recognized the practical handwriting of someone who wrote notes between shifts, perhaps during brief breaks at work, efficient and clear, without unnecessary flourishes. "Mr. Caldwell, your letter was unexpected. Michael spoke highly of you, despite your differences. However, my primary concern is protecting Emma and Zoe. They've experienced enough loss and upheaval in their young lives. If you're sincere about wanting to meet, I suggest the Blue Door Cafe on Marshall Street this Saturday at 2 p.m. It's a public place where the girls feel safe. I expect complete honesty about your intentions. To be clear, if this meeting causes any distress to my nieces, it will be our last. Regards, Clara Johnson." Henry read the letter twice, noting the firm but fair tone. Clara Johnson's protective instincts were evident in every carefully chosen word, from her direct approach to her clear boundaries. He respected that. It was exactly what the girls needed in their lives. He wrote back immediately, confirming the time and place. The Blue Door Cafe was a far cry from his usual establishments, with their crystal chandeliers and leather-bound menus, but that didn't matter. What mattered was taking this first step, however small, toward understanding the world Michael had embraced and the people he had chosen to help. As he sealed the envelope, pressing down firmly on the adhesive strip, Henry realized this meeting could go either way. Clara Johnson's boundaries were clear, and he would need to prove himself worthy of their trust. For the first time in years, he felt nervous about meeting someone, not because of their status or what they could offer him, but because of what they represented. A chance to connect with a part of Michael he had never known, a glimpse into the life his son had lived beyond the walls of their estate. Henry shifted uncomfortably in the wooden chair at the Blue Door Cafe, his tailored suit standing out among the casual Saturday afternoon crowd. The cheerful chatter and coffee machine whirring created a homey atmosphere that felt alien compared to his usual haunts. Clara Johnson arrived precisely on time, ushering Emma and Zoe through the cafe's entrance. The girls wore simple but neat clothing, and Henry noticed Emma's protective stance beside her younger sister. "Mr. Caldwell," Clara nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "Thank you for suggesting this meeting." They settled into their seats and a friendly waitress with a worn notepad took their orders. Henry watched as Zoe's eyes lit up at the mention of hot chocolate with extra whipped cream. "Michael always got the same thing," Emma said softly, a small smile playing at her lips. "Hot chocolate with cinnamon." Henry's throat tightened. I didn't know that about him." "There's probably a lot you didn't know," Clara said, but her tone held more sadness than accusation. As their drinks arrived, Zoe carefully wrapped her hands around the warm mug, looking remarkably like Michael used to when he was her age. "Mr. Michael helped me with my science project last year," she offered. "We made a model of the solar system. He said dreams are like stars. They might seem far away, but they're worth reaching for." Emma nodded, gaining confidence. "He believed in education more than anything. When Mom died and we thought we'd have to give up on college." She paused, collecting herself. "Michael showed us how to apply for scholarships. He taught us that success isn't just about money. It's about making a difference." Henry felt a familiar ache in his chest, but this time it was mixed with something else. Pride, perhaps. "What are your dreams?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I want to be a teacher," Emma replied, "like Mom was and Zoe." "I'm going to be a doctor," Zoe announced, her chin lifting, "to help sick kids like me." Henry blinked, noticing for the first time the medical alert bracelet on Zoe's wrist. Clara's hand instinctively moved to cover her niece's. "Michael helped us see past our circumstances," Emma continued. "He said we shouldn't let anything hold us back." Henry reached for his briefcase, pulling out his checkbook. "I could help with that. Your education, Zoe's medical bills?" "No, thank you," Emma said firmly but kindly. "Michael taught us about dignity too. We're managing." Clara squeezed Emma's shoulder, obvious pride in her expression. "Then let me do something," Henry insisted, unused to having his money refused. "Michael would have wanted—" "What Michael wanted," Emma interrupted gently, "was for people to believe in themselves. If you want to honor him—" Maybe just spend time getting to know us? That's worth more than money. Henry slowly returned the checkbook to his briefcase, struck by the wisdom in Emma's words. He saw now what Michael had seen: strength, determination, and integrity that no amount of money could buy. "I'd like that," he said quietly, and for the first time since sitting down, he truly relaxed into his chair. They spent the next hour sharing stories about Michael, each one helping Henry piece together a clearer picture of his son's life and values. As they prepared to leave, Zoe suddenly asked, "Will you come to my school play next month? I'm playing the lead star in our science musical." Henry caught Clara's slight nod of approval before answering, "I wouldn't miss it." Henry stepped into the gleaming corporate headquarters of Caldwell Industries, his footsteps echoing across the marble lobby. The morning's warmth from the cafe encounter quickly faded as he made his way to the executive floor. Richard Bennett was waiting by his office door, a stack of reports clutched in his hands. His pressed suit and stern expression spoke volumes before he even opened his mouth. "Henry, we need to talk," Richard said, following him into the office uninvited. "The quarterly numbers are concerning." Henry settled behind his desk, noting how the familiar leather chair no longer felt as comfortable as it once had. "I'm listening." "Are you?" Richard's tone sharpened. "Because lately it seems your mind is elsewhere. The Thompson deal is stalling, and the Beijing expansion is behind schedule." Before Henry could respond, his assistant buzzed to remind him of the emergency board meeting. Richard's tight smile suggested he'd orchestrated this timing. The boardroom was already full when they arrived. 12 faces turned toward Henry, their expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed hostility. The presentation screen displayed a harsh downward trend in red. "Gentlemen," Richard addressed the room standing at the opposite end of the table from Henry, "our profits have declined 15% this quarter. Client confidence is wavering, and our competitors are taking notice." Henry watched as Richard clicked through slides highlighting missed opportunities and delayed projects. Each point felt like a personal attack. "And where has our CEO's attention been?" Richard continued, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. "Making social calls to community centers and following school children around town?" Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Henry felt heat rise in his neck, but kept his voice steady. "If you're referring to my personal time that's bleeding into business hours," Richard interrupted. "We've built this company on dedication and focus, Henry. Your father understood that. Even Michael." "Don't." Henry's voice cut through the room like steel. "Don't use my son to make your point." Richard pressed on, undeterred. "The board has concerns, Henry. Valid ones. We need to know if you're still committed to this company's success." Henry stood slowly, placing both hands on the polished table. "I've given 30 years to this company. I've sacrificed—" He paused, memories of missed birthdays and school events flashing through his mind. "I've sacrificed more than you know." "Then prove it," Richard challenged. "Stop these distractions. Focus on what matters." The words hung in the air, and Henry felt the weight of every eye in the room. He thought of Emma's quiet strength, Zoe's bright dreams, and Michael's hidden legacy. "What matters," Henry said carefully, "is not always measured in profit margins." A murmur rippled through the board members. Richard's face darkened with disapproval. "This company needs decisive leadership," Richard pressed. "Not philosophy, not charity. Leadership." Henry straightened his spine, feeling the pressure of expectations bearing down on him. The same pressure he'd once placed on Michael. The same pressure that had driven them apart. "The leadership this company has," he responded firmly, "is exactly what you see before you. If that's not satisfactory, the board is welcome to voice their concerns formally." The tension in the room was palpable. Richard's jaw clenched as he gathered his papers, clearly unsatisfied with Henry's response. The other board members exchanged glances, their loyalty wavering between tradition and transformation. The community center buzzed with activity during their annual talent show. Linda Morales watched from the side as Zoe prepared to perform her poetry reading, her small hands clutching a piece of paper that trembled slightly. Emma sat in the front row, beaming with pride as her sister walked onto the makeshift stage. Henry stood at the back of the room, having arrived just minutes before at Linda's invitation. "My poem is called Angels Among Us," Zoe began, her voice clear and sweet. But halfway through the second verse, she stumbled over her words. Her face grew pale, and the paper slipped from her fingers. "Zoe," Emma called out, rising from her seat. The young girl swayed on her feet, her hand pressing against her chest. Before anyone could reach her, Zoe's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the stage. "Zoe!" Emma screamed, rushing forward as Linda ran to the stage. Henry pushed through the crowd gathering around the stage. "Call an ambulance," he commanded, his voice cutting through the panic. Linda was already on her phone, speaking urgently to emergency services. Emma cradled her sister's head, tears streaming down her face. "She's burning up," she said, her voice shaking. "Zoe, please wake up." Henry knelt beside them, his expensive suit gathering dust from the stage floor. He checked Zoe's pulse. It was rapid and irregular. "The ambulance is coming," he assured Emma, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. Aunt Clara burst through the community center doors, having been called by Linda. Her face drained of color at the sight of Zoe unconscious on the stage. When the ambulance arrived, Henry didn't hesitate. "I'm riding with them," he announced, helping Emma into the back of the vehicle. Aunt Clara nodded gratefully, following in Henry's car with his driver. The hospital emergency room was a blur of activity. Doctors and nurses swarmed around Zoe, calling out medical terms that made Emma's head spin. Henry stood like a sentinel beside Emma and Aunt Clara, his presence somehow anchoring them in the chaos. After what felt like hours, a doctor in blue scrubs approached them. His expression was grave as he introduced himself as Dr. Patterson. "Zoe has a serious heart condition," he explained gently. "She's suffering from dilated cardiomyopathy. Her heart isn't pumping blood effectively." Emma gripped her aunt's hand. "But you can fix it, right?" Dr. Patterson's face softened. "She needs immediate treatment, possibly surgery. We'll need to run more tests, but time is of the essence." "The cost," Aunt Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't," Henry interrupted firmly. "Don't even think about that right now." He turned to Dr. Patterson. "Whatever she needs, whatever specialists are required, I'll take care of everything." Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude and fear. "Mr. Caldwell, we can't—" "Yes, you can," Henry said softly, remembering Michael's words in his journal about never turning away from someone in need. "Let me help. Please." Dr. Patterson cleared his throat. "We'll need to admit her immediately and begin treatment. One of you can stay with her tonight." Emma looked torn between staying with her sister and supporting her aunt. Henry watched the silent struggle play across her face, seeing in it the same protective instinct he'd once witnessed in Michael. The severity of Zoe's condition hung heavy in the sterile hospital air, transforming their tentative connection into something deeper, more urgent. Henry felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, not as an obligation, but as something he chose to carry. The morning sun cast long shadows across Henry's corner office as Richard Bennett strode in unannounced, his face tight with barely contained anger. Henry looked up from Zoe's medical reports, which he'd been reviewing before the day's board meeting. "This has gone far enough, Henry," Richard declared, dropping a stack of financial reports onto the mahogany desk. "Our Q3 numbers are abysmal. The press is having a field day with your frequent absences, and shareholders are getting nervous." Henry straightened in his chair. "I've delegated responsibilities appropriately, Richard. The company isn't falling apart because I've taken some personal time." "Personal time?" Richard scoffed. "You've missed 3 major investor meetings in the past 2 weeks. You're spending your days at some community center and hanging around hospitals with strangers. This isn't the Henry Caldwell who built this company." Before Henry could respond, his assistant Margaret Thompson's voice came through the intercom. "The board is assembled in the main conference room, Mr. Caldwell." The conference room felt colder than usual as Henry took his seat at the head of the table. 12 stern faces stared back at him, with Richard taking his place at the opposite end. "We've called this emergency session," began Victoria Chen, one of the senior board members. to address the concerning direction of Caldwell Industries under current leadership. Charts and graphs flashed across the wall screen, showing declining stock prices and missed opportunities. Each board member took turns highlighting failures and missteps, their voices growing more accusatory with each presentation. "And now," Richard said, standing up, "you're proposing to divert substantial company resources into a medical fund for a child you barely know?" His voice dripped with disdain. "This isn't a charity, Henry. It's a Fortune 500 company." Henry's jaw tightened. "My personal finances are inextricably linked to this company's reputation," Richard cut in. "The board has reached a decision. Either you recommit yourself fully to Caldwell Industries, or we'll be forced to call for a vote of no confidence." The ultimatum hung heavy in the air. Henry looked around the table, seeing nothing but cold determination in the faces of people he'd worked with for years. "You have until the end of the week," Victoria added, her tone softer but no less firm. "We need your complete focus back on the company. No more hospital visits, no more community center, no more distractions." Henry sat in silence, his mind racing. The empire he'd built over decades now felt like a cage. Images flashed through his mind. Zoe's pale face in the hospital bed, Emma's worried eyes, and the journal entries where Michael had written about the joy of making a real difference in people's lives. "Take the time to think it through," Richard said, gathering his papers. "But remember everything you've worked for, everything you've built. Don't throw it all away on some misguided attempt to ease your conscience." As the board members filed out, Henry remained seated, staring at his reflection in the polished conference table. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. On one side lay the familiar world of corporate power and wealth he'd dedicated his life to building. On the other, a chance to honor his son's memory and help two young girls who had somehow worked their way into his heart. His phone buzzed with a text from the hospital. Zoe's latest test results were in. The board's ultimatum echoed in his mind as he stared at the message, torn between the two worlds that seemed impossible to reconcile. Henry stood in his office, gazing out at the city skyline he'd helped shape over decades. The weight of the board's ultimatum pressed against his chest, but for the first time in years, clarity cut through his confusion like a shaft of sunlight. He pressed the intercom. "Margaret, get me Dr. Sarah Chen at Memorial Hospital, and call my lawyer." Within hours, Henry sat across from Dr. Chen, one of the country's leading pediatric cardiologists, in her pristine office. The doctor reviewed Zoe's files with careful consideration. "The condition is serious," Dr. Chen explained, adjusting her glasses. "But with proper treatment and monitoring, we can significantly improve her quality of life." "Whatever it costs," Henry said firmly. "I want her to have the best care possible." Later that afternoon, Henry walked into Zoe's hospital room, where Emma and Aunt Clara sat beside the pale young girl. The familiar beeping of monitors filled the silence as he cleared his throat. "I've made some arrangements," he began, his voice softer than usual. "Dr. Chen is one of the best heart specialists in the country. She's agreed to take Zoe's case personally." Emma's eyes widened. "But we can't possibly—" "I'm covering all expenses," Henry interrupted gently. "The treatments, medications, follow-up care, everything." Aunt Clara stood up, her face a mix of gratitude and concern. "Mr. Caldwell, this is too much. We couldn't accept—" "Please," Henry said, surprising himself with the emotion in his voice. "Michael saw something special in these girls. I was too blind to see it then, but I see it now." He moved closer to Zoe's bedside. "Let me do this, not as charity, but as family." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she stood and, without warning, wrapped her arms around Henry. He stiffened for a moment, then slowly relaxed into the embrace. It felt natural, like something he'd been missing without knowing it. "Thank you," Emma whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Michael always said you had a good heart, even if you didn't show it. He was right." Zoe reached out and took Henry's hand, her small fingers curling around his. "Does this mean you'll visit more often?" she asked hopefully. Henry squeezed her hand gently, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the hospital room's temperature. "Yes," he promised, I'll be here as much as you want." The afternoon sun painted the room in soft golden light as they discussed the treatment plan. Henry watched Emma fuss over her sister's pillows, saw the protective love in Aunt Clara's eyes, and felt, for the first time since Michael's death, that he was exactly where he needed to be. "Michael would be proud," Emma said quietly as they looked over Dr. Chen's treatment schedule together. "Not just of what you're doing, but of who you're becoming." Henry nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The board's threats seemed distant now, insignificant compared to the genuine connection he felt in this moment. Here, in this simple hospital room, he'd found something his wealth and power had never given him, a chance to make a real difference, just as Michael had always tried to teach him. In the dimly lit executive dining room after hours, Richard Bennett sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. 7 board members listened intently as he laid out his case against Henry Caldwell. "Gentlemen, our CEO has lost his way," Richard said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "Quarterly profits are down 12%. Client confidence is wavering. And where is Henry? Playing charity worker with a pair of street kids." He spread several folders across the table, each containing carefully prepared documents. "I've taken the liberty of preparing a complete analysis of the company's decline since Henry's distraction began. But removing a CEO of his standing," Douglas Wheeler, one of the older board members, shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. "The press will have a field day." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Which is why we'll frame it as a mutual decision. Henry's been through a terrible loss. He needs time to grieve properly. We're doing him a favor, really." Outside the dining room, Margaret Thompson stood frozen, her hand covering her mouth to stifle any sound. She'd come to drop off some late paperwork, not expecting to find the board in secret session. Her heart pounded as she listened to them systematically dismantle her boss's reputation. "I move for an emergency vote tomorrow morning," Richard announced. 9 a.m. sharp. Henry won't know what hit him until it's too late. The board members murmured their agreement, and Margaret heard chairs scraping against the floor. She quickly ducked into a nearby supply closet, waiting until their footsteps faded down the hallway. 20 minutes later, she burst into Henry's office, finding him reviewing Zoe's medical reports. "Sir," she said, slightly out of breath, "I need to tell you something important." Henry looked up, noting the urgency in her expression. "What is it, Margaret?" She closed the door carefully behind her. "I just overheard Richard Bennett with the board. They're planning to vote you out tomorrow morning at 9. The color drained from Henry's face. He set down the medical report and leaned back in his chair, processing the betrayal. "Tell me everything you heard." As Margaret recounted the meeting's details, Henry's expression hardened. 30 years he'd led this company, built it from a modest regional business into an international powerhouse. And now, because he'd finally chosen to honor his son's memory, to do something truly meaningful, they wanted him gone. "Richard always was ambitious," Henry said quietly. "But I never thought he'd go this far." "What will you do, sir?" Margaret asked, wringing her hands. Henry stood and walked to the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the growing darkness. "Prepare the conference room for 8:30 tomorrow morning," he said firmly. "And get me the company's charitable giving records for the past 20 years. "Yes, sir." Margaret paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Mr. Caldwell, I think what you're doing for those girls is wonderful. Michael would be proud." Henry nodded, his throat tight with emotion. After Margaret left, he sat back down at his desk and began preparing for tomorrow's confrontation. The board thought they had him cornered, but they'd forgotten one crucial detail. Henry Caldwell hadn't built this company by backing down from a fight. He worked late into the night, gathering documents and preparing his defense, not just for his position, but for everything he'd come to believe in over these past few weeks. The sun was rising over the city skyline when he finally finished, ready to face whatever the morning would bring. At 8:30 sharp, Henry Caldwell strode into the conference room with purpose, his leather briefcase in hand. The board members, already seated around the massive oak table, fell silent at his unexpected arrival. Richard Bennett's smug expression faltered slightly. "Good morning, gentlemen," Henry said, his voice steady and clear. "I believe we have some matters to discuss." Richard recovered quickly, straightening his tie. "Henry, this meeting wasn't scheduled until 9. "Yes, I know about the meeting you planned, Richard. The one where you intended to vote me out." Henry placed his briefcase on the table with a soft thud. "I also know about the secret session you held last night." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Douglas Wheeler couldn't meet Henry's eyes, while others suddenly found their notepads fascinating. "You've been neglecting your duties," Richard said, his voice sharp. "The company is suffering. Profits are down. Client confidence is wavering, all because you've been playing social worker with those children." Henry pulled out several folders and laid them on the table. "Interesting perspective, Richard. Let's talk about numbers, shall we?" He distributed the documents. "These are our charitable giving records for the past 20 years. Notice anything?" The board members flipped through the pages, frowning. "Under my leadership, this company has given less than 1% of its profits to charity. My son Michael tried to change that, but I wouldn't listen." Henry's voice grew softer. "I was wrong." Richard scoffed. "We're not a charity, Henry. We're a business." "Yes, we are. A business I built from nothing." Henry stood tall, commanding the room. "But at what cost? I lost my son because I couldn't see beyond profit margins and quarterly reports." "This is exactly what we're talking about," Richard interrupted. "You're letting personal matters cloud your judgment." "No, Richard. For the first time in 30 years, my judgment is crystal clear." Henry looked each board member in the eye. "You don't need to vote me out. I resign." A collective gasp filled the room. Richard's triumphant smile froze on his face. "But before I go, let me tell you what real success looks like," Henry continued. "It looks like a 12-year-old girl fighting for her life, and her sister who never leaves her side. It looks like a community center full of people my son helped, people whose lives are better because he saw their worth beyond their bank accounts." He gathered his belongings slowly, deliberately. "You can have the company, Richard. I choose to honor my son's legacy instead." The boardroom remained dead silent as Henry walked to the door. He paused, turning back one final time. "Oh, and Richard? My personal shares in the company will be converted into a charitable trust. I'm sure you'll handle that transition professionally." With those words, Henry Caldwell walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind 30 years of corporate power and taking with him something far more valuable, his integrity. The community center buzzed with activity as Henry Caldwell rolled up his sleeves, helping Linda Morales organize donations for the upcoming winter drive. Gone was his tailored suit, replaced by a comfortable sweater and slacks. His silver hair caught the morning light streaming through the windows as he sorted through boxes of warm clothing. "I never thought I'd see Henry Caldwell doing manual labor," Linda said with a warm smile. "You've surprised us all." Henry paused, holding a child's winter coat. "I've surprised myself, Linda, but this feels right." Margaret Thompson, who had resigned from the company to join Henry's new venture, arrived with a stack of legal documents. "The paperwork for the Michael Caldwell Foundation is ready for review," she announced, setting the files on a nearby table. "Thank you, Margaret." Henry's eyes lit up as he examined the documents. "This foundation will ensure Michael's work continues. Every child deserves a chance, just like he believed." Emma Johnson entered the community center, pushing Zoe's wheelchair. The younger girl's color had improved since her surgery, and her bright smile filled the room. "Mr. Caldwell," Zoe called out. "Are you really starting a foundation?" Henry knelt beside her wheelchair. "I am, and I want you and Emma to help me shape it. You knew Michael's heart better than anyone." Emma's eyes widened. "Us? But we're just—" "You're exactly who Michael would want involved," Henry insisted. "Your perspective is invaluable." Later that afternoon, Henry led Margaret and Linda through his mansion. Real estate agents would arrive tomorrow to list it for sale. The enormous house echoed with their footsteps. "Are you certain about selling?" Linda asked, looking around at the pristine surroundings. Henry nodded firmly. "This house represents who I used to be. Isolated, focused on appearances. The foundation needs substantial funding, and this place, he gestured to the high ceilings and expensive artwork. It's just walls and windows now. Margaret made notes on her tablet. The sale will provide enough capital to fund the foundation for years. We can help hundreds of children. Thousands, Henry corrected, stopping before Michael's portrait in the hallway. We'll help thousands of children find their path, just like Michael tried to do. He touched the frame gently. This portrait will hang in the foundation's office. Somewhere it can inspire others instead of gathering dust in this empty house. Linda watched him with understanding. The community already sees the change in you, Henry. This gesture will mean so much to them. It's not about what it means to them, Henry said softly. It's about doing what's right. What Michael always knew was right. As they walked through the grand foyer one last time, Henry felt lighter with each step. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers no longer impressed him. Instead, he thought of the warm, crowded community center, of Zoe's resilient spirit, and of Emma's determined grace. He thought of Michael's legacy, finally being honored in the way it deserved. Tomorrow, he said to Margaret, let's start planning our first scholarship program. These children deserve every chance we can give them. Henry stood on the worn front porch of the Johnsons' modest home, his heart beating faster than usual. The peeling paint and creaky steps were a far cry from his former mansion, but somehow this place felt more alive. He knocked on the door, clutching a folder of foundation documents. Aunt Clara opened the door, her expression cautious but not unwelcoming. Mr. Caldwell, please come in. The small living room was neat but cramped, with mismatched furniture that spoke of making do with what was available. Family photos lined the walls, including several of Michael with the girls. I wanted to discuss something important with you, Henry began, settling into an offered chair. These past months, getting to know Emma and Zoe, they've changed my life in ways I never expected. Aunt Clara sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. They have that effect on people. Michael saw it too. That's exactly why I'm here, Henry said, opening the folder. I want to be more involved in their lives, not just through the foundation, but as... He paused, searching for the right words. As family. Aunt Clara's eyes widened slightly. Family? I know I have no right to ask this. My own relationship with Michael was... He swallowed hard. But these girls, they've helped me understand what I missed with my own son. I want to be there for them properly. They spent the next hour talking, Aunt Clara sharing stories of the girls' struggles and triumphs, while Henry listened intently. His genuine interest and concern showed in every question he asked. You're not the same man who first showed up here, Aunt Clara observed, pouring them both fresh coffee. The girls talk about you differently now, too. How so? With trust, with affection. She smiled softly. Zoe's birthday is next weekend. Perhaps you'd like to join us? Henry's face lit up. I'd be honored. The following Saturday, the Johnsons' small backyard transformed into a celebration. Colorful balloons swayed in the breeze, and a homemade banner proclaimed, "Happy Birthday, Zoe." Henry arrived early, helping Emma set up folding chairs while Aunt Clara finished decorating the cake. Zoe's face glowed with joy as she opened presents surrounded by friends from the community center. When she reached Henry's gift, art supplies she'd mentioned wanting weeks ago, she launched herself from her wheelchair into his arms. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," she exclaimed. "Henry," he corrected gently. "You can call me Henry." Emma joined them, carrying plates of cake. "Only if you stop being so formal, too. No more Miss Johnson, just Emma." Aunt Clara watched from the porch steps as Henry helped Zoe back into her wheelchair, noting how natural their interaction had become. The way he looked at both girls reminded her of how Michael used to look at them, with genuine love and pride. As they gathered around the picnic table singing "Happy Birthday," Henry felt tears prick at his eyes. This simple celebration, full of laughter and love, meant more than any corporate victory ever had. Looking at these faces, Zoe's excitement, Emma's quiet contentment, Aunt Clara's approving smile. He knew he'd finally found what he'd been missing all along. A real family. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the study windows as Henry sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes containing Michael's belongings. He'd been putting this off for months, but something about the morning's birthday celebration, perhaps the way the candles had flickered, reminding him of Michael's last birthday, had given him the strength to finally face this task. His fingers trembled as he opened the first box, the cardboard creaking softly in the quiet room. Inside, beneath old college textbooks and faded photographs that made his heart clench, he found a bundle of envelopes tied together with twine. His breath caught when he saw his own name written in Michael's familiar handwriting on each one, the letters slightly slanted just as they'd always been. To Dad, they read, dates spanning the last 5 years of Michael's life. None had ever been mailed, their sealed flaps a testament to words left unspoken. Henry carefully untied the bundle, the twine rough against his fingers, and opened the earliest letter. The paper felt delicate in his hands, as if it might crumble like his composure, yellowed slightly at the edges from time. Dear Dad, the first one began. I tried telling you about the community center today, about the kids there who remind me so much of myself at that age, looking for someone to believe in them. You talked about quarterly reports instead. I wonder if you know how much that hurt. The way you looked past me, like my dreams weren't even worth acknowledging. Henry's throat tightened. He remembered that dinner clearly now, how he'd dismissed Michael's passion as naive idealism, the way his son's shoulders had slumped as he'd pulled out his laptop to show another spreadsheet. The next letter was dated 6 months later. I met 2 sisters today, Emma and Zoe. Their mother just passed away. When they smiled for the first time in weeks, I finally understood what real success feels like. I wish I could make you understand too. These moments mean more than any profit margin ever could. Letter after letter revealed Michael's world, his hopes, his fears, his desperate desire for his father's approval. Some were angry, others pleading. All of them showed a depth of feeling Henry had never allowed himself to see. Each page filled with emotions he'd been too blind to recognize. Sometimes I think about the fishing trips we used to take when I was little, one letter read, before the company became everything. Remember how you taught me to tie fishing knots? How patient you were, showing me again and again until I got it right. I felt like I could tell you anything then. What happened to us, Dad? When did spreadsheets become more important than sunrises? Henry's hands shook as he read through tears that fell freely now, staining the paper. Each word was like a knife to his heart, showing him the son he'd failed to truly know. Michael had wanted so much more than success. He'd wanted connection, understanding, love. Things that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or profit margins. The final letter, dated just weeks before the accident, hit Henry hardest of all. Dad, I keep writing these letters I never send. Maybe because I'm afraid of what you'll say. Or maybe because deep down, I still hope that one day you'll see me, really see me, without me having to explain. The work I do matters. These kids matter. Their smiles, their hope, their futures. It all matters. I wish you could be proud of who I am, not just what I might become. Sometimes I wonder if you'll ever understand that success isn't always measured in dollars. Henry clutched the letters to his chest, his body racked with sobs that echoed in the empty study. The weight of every missed opportunity, every dismissive word, every time he'd chosen the company over his son, crashed over him like a wave. The setting sun painted the room in shades of orange and gold, a bitter reminder of all the sunsets he'd missed sharing with his son. I'm sorry, he whispered to the empty room, to the son who would never hear these words. I'm so sorry, Michael. I was so wrong. The letters scattered around him told the story of a son he'd never truly known, a man whose heart had been so much bigger than Henry had ever realized. Each page revealed another layer of Michael's journey, his growth, his compassion, and Henry's own blindness to it all. The paper trail of a relationship that had withered while he wasn't paying attention. Through his tears, Henry looked at the final letter again, reading Michael's words over and over until they blurred before his eyes. His son had wanted nothing more than his father's understanding and approval. Now, surrounded by these undelivered pieces of Michael's heart, Henry felt the full magnitude of what he'd lost and what he needed to do to honor his son's memory. These letters weren't just a goodbye. They were a roadmap to redemption, showing him exactly where he'd gone wrong and how he might make it right. The community center buzzed with excitement as people gathered for the launch of the Michael Caldwell Foundation. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and chairs filled the main hall where community members, reporters, and photographers waited eagerly. The simple space had been transformed with fresh paint and flowers, though it retained its welcoming atmosphere. Margaret Thompson moved efficiently through the crowd, directing staff and checking final details. She paused occasionally to answer questions from the press, her pride in the foundation's mission evident in every word. Linda Morales stood near the entrance, greeting guests with warm smiles and genuine enthusiasm. Emma and Zoe Johnson helped arrange refreshments at a side table, both wearing new dresses for the occasion. Zoe's health had improved significantly thanks to her treatments, and her bright smile lit up the room. Emma watched her sister with evident relief, occasionally glancing at the growing crowd with a mix of nervousness and pride. Local news crews set up their equipment, their presence drawing curious onlookers from the neighborhood. The story had already caught media attention. The wealthy CEO who gave up everything to honor his son's legacy. Reporters scribbled in notepads as community members shared stories about Michael's impact on their lives. The Channel 5 news anchor approached Henry for a pre-event interview. "Mr. Caldwell, your transformation from corporate CEO to philanthropist has captured public interest. What prompted this dramatic change?" Henry adjusted his tie, a simple blue one Michael had given him years ago. "Sometimes we need to lose everything to see what truly matters," he replied, his voice steady. "My son understood that long before I did." The story ran on multiple channels that evening. Former CEO Henry Caldwell launches Community Foundation, the headlines declared. Images showed Henry working alongside community members, talking with children and helping at food drives. The contrast with his previous media coverage, all stern business portraits and corporate announcements, was striking. Sources close to Caldwell Industries expressed surprise at their former CEO's new direction. One reporter narrated over footage of Henry helping Zoe with her homework. But those who knew Michael Caldwell say this foundation perfectly honors the young man's vision. Standing at the podium later that afternoon, Henry looked out at the gathered faces. He saw hope in their eyes, the same hope Michael had seen. His prepared speech lay forgotten in his pocket as he spoke from his heart. "My son Michael understood something I took too long to learn," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "He knew that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or stock portfolios. It's measured in the lives we touch, the hope we inspire, and the community we build together." He gestured to Emma and Zoe in the front row. "These young ladies taught me that lesson again. Through them, I finally saw what Michael had been trying to show me all along, that every person has value beyond measure, that every dream deserves support, and that real success means lifting others up." Linda Morales dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as Henry continued. "This foundation isn't just about writing checks or funding programs. It's about continuing Michael's work of building bridges, creating opportunities, and believing in people. It's about recognizing that we're all connected, all valuable, all worthy of support and respect." The room fell silent as Henry's voice grew thick with emotion. "I spent years chasing the wrong kind of success. Today, we begin chasing Michael's dream, a dream of community, compassion, and real lasting change. Together, we'll build something far more valuable than any fortune I ever amassed. We'll build hope." The applause that followed was deafening, but Henry barely heard it. His eyes were fixed on Michael's photo on the foundation's banner, his son's smile seeming to shine with approval at last. The autumn evening at the community center turned frantic when Zoe suddenly clutched her chest during an art class. Her face went pale, and her breathing became labored. The colored pencils she'd been using clattered to the floor as she slumped in her chair. "Something's wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Emma dropped everything and rushed to her sister's side, her hands trembling as she held Zoe's shoulders. "Henry!" she called out, panic rising in her voice. "Henry, please help!" Henry, who had been reviewing foundation paperwork in the next room, burst through the door. One look at Zoe's ashen face told him everything he needed to know. Without hesitation, he scooped her up in his arms, her small frame feeling frighteningly fragile. "Call an ambulance," he commanded, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. The center erupted into controlled chaos as Linda Morales dialed 911 while clearing a path to the entrance. The ambulance ride felt endless. Emma held her sister's hand while paramedics worked, their urgent movements and technical terms creating a blur of anxiety. Henry sat forward, his normally composed face etched with worry as he watched the medical team work. At the hospital, Dr. Sarah Chen, Zoe's cardiac specialist, met them in the emergency room. Her usual warm smile was replaced with a look of professional concern as she examined the test results. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face as she delivered the news. "The medication isn't working as well as we'd hoped," Dr. Chen explained, her voice gentle but direct. "There are complications we didn't anticipate. The pressure in Zoe's heart has increased significantly." Emma's grip on Henry's arm tightened. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice small. Dr. Chen adjusted her glasses, choosing her words carefully. "We need to perform surgery to repair the damage. However, given Zoe's condition, the procedure carries significant risks." The word risks hung heavy in the air. Through the window of Zoe's room, they could see her sleeping, monitors beeping steadily around her bed. She looked so young, so vulnerable against the stark white hospital sheets. "What kind of risks?" Henry asked, his businessman's instinct for details kicking in even as his heart ached. Dr. Chen explained the complications, the strain on Zoe's heart, the possibility of failure, the delicate nature of the procedure. Each word felt like a weight pressing down on Emma's shoulders. She began to shake, tears streaming down her face. Henry guided Emma to the chairs in the hallway, sitting beside her as she broke down. The sterile hospital corridor seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, its walls containing countless similar scenes of fear and hope. "I can't lose her," Emma sobbed, her composure finally cracking. "She's all I have left of our family. I can't—" Henry wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close like he wished he'd done more often with Michael. "Listen to me, Emma," he said firmly but gently. "You're not alone in this. Not anymore. We're going to get through this together, all of us." Emma looked up at him, her eyes red but finding strength in his steady gaze. In that moment, she saw what Michael had always seen in his father. Not the cold businessman, but the capable, caring man underneath who could be counted on when it mattered most. "Whatever Zoe needs, specialists, equipment, anything, we'll make it happen," Henry continued. "I promise you, we'll fight this together, every step of the way." The hospital waiting room felt like a world suspended in time. Henry and Emma sat side by side in the uncomfortable plastic chairs, watching the minutes crawl by on the wall clock. The surgery had been underway for 3 hours, and the tension was palpable. Emma fidgeted with a worn photograph she'd pulled from her pocket. Henry glanced over, catching a glimpse of a smiling woman who shared Emma's warm brown eyes. "That's your mother?" he asked softly. Emma nodded, running her thumb over the creased edge. "This was taken about a month before she got sick. We were at the park, and Zoe had just learned to ride her bike without training wheels." Henry smiled, picturing the scene. "Michael loved bikes too. He used to beg me to teach him, but I was always too busy with work." His voice caught slightly. "The gardener ended up teaching him instead." "Michael told us about that," Emma said, looking up at him. "But he also told us about the time you stayed up all night helping him build a science fair project." Henry's eyes widened in surprise. He remembered that. "He told us lots of stories about you," Emma continued. "Even the hard ones. He understood why you pushed him so much. You wanted him to be successful." Henry's shoulders slumped. "I pushed him away. I was so focused on the business, on building something for him to inherit, that I forgot to build a relationship with him instead." He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion. I didn't understand what really mattered until it was too late. Emma reached over and squeezed his hand. It's not too late to honor what he cared about. When I see you and Zoe, Henry said, I see what Michael saw, the importance of connection, of being there for others. I've learned more about my son through knowing you both than I did in all those years of living under the same roof. We're not looking for another father, Emma said carefully, but Zoe and we could use someone who cares. Henry turned to face her fully. I know I can't replace anyone, and I wouldn't try to, but I want you both to know that I'm here, not out of obligation or guilt, but because I care about you, both of you. Just then, Dr. Alan Peters appeared in the waiting room doorway, still wearing his surgical scrubs. Henry and Emma jumped to their feet, hearts pounding. The surgeon's face broke into a tired smile. The surgery was successful, he announced. Zoe did beautifully. We were able to repair the damage and her vitals are strong. Emma's knees buckled with relief and Henry steadied her with an arm around her shoulders. Tears streamed down her face, but this time they were tears of joy. When can we see her? Henry asked, his own voice unsteady with emotion. She's in recovery now, Dr. Peters replied. Once she's settled in her room, you can visit. She'll need to take it easy for a while, but with proper care and rehabilitation, she should make a full recovery. Emma turned and hugged Henry tightly, catching him by surprise. After a moment's hesitation, he returned the embrace, feeling the weight of worry lifting from both their shoulders. Over the weeks following Zoe's surgery, Henry became a constant presence in the Johnson household. The modest two-bedroom apartment, so different from his former mansion, began to feel more like home than any place he'd lived before. One afternoon, he sat at the kitchen table helping Zoe with her math homework, while Emma worked on a history essay nearby. The sunlight streamed through the small window, catching the determined expression on Zoe's face as she tackled another problem. I think I've got it now, Zoe said, pushing her notebook toward Henry. Can you check my work? Henry leaned over, carefully reviewing her calculations. Perfect. You're really getting the hang of these fractions. Emma looked up from her laptop, smiling at her sister's achievement. Maybe you can help me with my essay next? It's about the Industrial Revolution. That's actually my specialty, Henry chuckled, remembering his business school days. Let me see what you've got. From the doorway, Aunt Clara watched the scene unfold, a warm cup of tea in her hands. She noticed how naturally Henry fit into their lives now, helping with homework, driving the girls to doctor's appointments, even attending their school events. It was a far cry from the cold businessmen who had first approached them months ago. Later that evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Aunt Clara invited Henry to stay for a cup of coffee. They sat in the small living room, the wall clock ticking softly in the background. You've changed their lives, you know, Aunt Clara said quietly. Both of them. Henry shook his head modestly. They've changed mine. I never knew what I was missing until I met them. I see how much you care for them, Aunt Clara continued, setting her cup down carefully. And I see how much they've come to depend on you. Henry nodded, thinking of the past few months. The hospital visits, the homework sessions, the simple joy of being part of their daily lives. I've been thinking, Aunt Clara said, her voice serious but gentle. My arthritis is getting worse, and I worry about my ability to care for them properly in the future. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Have you ever considered becoming their legal guardian? Henry's breath caught in his throat. He'd grown to love the girls as his own, but he hadn't dared hope for such a possibility. I would never want to replace you, he said carefully. You're their family. And now so are you, Aunt Clara replied. I'm not going anywhere. I'll always be their aunt. But they need someone who can provide for them, support them through college, be there for all the moments ahead. She smiled softly. Someone who already loves them like a father. Henry felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. Do you really think they'd want that? I see the way they look at you, Aunt Clara said. Emma's starting to trust again. And Zoe, well, she lights up whenever you walk through that door. She reached across and patted his hand. "Just think about it. We can talk to them together when you're ready." The conversation settled between them, full of possibility and hope. Through the hallway, they could hear Zoe's gentle snoring and Emma's occasional murmur in her sleep, the peaceful sounds of the family they had all become. As word spread about Henry's potential guardianship of Emma and Zoe, whispers of concern rippled through the community. At the local coffee shop, where Linda Morales often held informal community meetings, several residents voiced their worries. "I just don't understand it," said Mrs. Rodriguez, a longtime resident. "What does a wealthy white businessman really know about raising 2 black girls from our neighborhood?" Others nodded in agreement, their skepticism clear in their expressions. The cultural and social divide felt wide and deep to many. "He's not the same man who first walked into this community center," Linda defended, though she understood their concerns. "I've seen his transformation firsthand." Still, the murmurs continued. Some questioned his motives, wondering if this was just an elaborate PR stunt to rebuild his image after leaving his company. Others worried about the girls losing their connection to their community and cultural heritage. When Henry learned of these concerns, he didn't retreat or become defensive. Instead, he requested a town hall meeting at the community center. The evening of the meeting, the center's main room was packed with familiar faces and skeptical expressions. Henry stood at the podium, his usual business attire replaced by casual clothes that reflected his new life. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he faced the crowd. "I understand your concerns," he began, his voice steady but humble. "A year ago, I wouldn't have understood this community at all. I lived in my mansion, isolated from the real world, blind to my own privilege." He paused, making eye contact with various community members. "I'm not here to pretend I have all the answers. I'm here to learn, to grow, and most importantly, to support Emma and Zoe in maintaining their connections to their community and culture." Linda stood up from her seat in the front row. "I've watched Henry spend countless hours here at the center. He doesn't just write checks. He shows up. He listens. He learns." Emma, who sat near the back with Zoe, raised her hand and spoke without waiting to be called on. "Mr. Caldwell didn't try to change us or our lives. Instead, he changed himself. He moved out of his mansion to be closer to our neighborhood. He asks questions about our culture and traditions. He makes sure we stay connected to who we are." An elderly gentleman in the third row stood up. "But what about when things get hard? When these girls face racism or discrimination? How will you handle that?" Henry nodded solemnly. "These are exactly the kinds of questions we should be asking. I can't fully understand their experiences, but I can listen, learn, and stand by them. I'm committed to educating myself and fighting alongside this community for justice and equality." He continued, "I'm not asking to replace anyone in their lives. I'm asking to add to their support system, to work together with this community to give them every opportunity possible while keeping them rooted in their identity and culture." The room grew quieter as people absorbed his words. Several who had been vocal critics nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up slowly. "You're not what I expected," she admitted. "Maybe that's a good thing." Others began sharing their own thoughts, and the conversation shifted from criticism to constructive dialogue about how to best support Emma and Zoe while maintaining their cultural connections. The tension in the room gradually dissolved into a spirit of cautious optimism and collaboration. By the end of the meeting, many who had arrived with crossed arms and frowns left with handshakes and words of encouragement. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it was a significant step toward understanding and unity. In a sunlit downtown office, Henry sat across from Ms. Diane Lewis, a family law attorney known for handling complex guardianship cases. Papers scattered across her mahogany desk as she reviewed his situation. "Mr. Caldwell, I need to be direct with you," Ms. Lewis said, adjusting her reading glasses. "Your recent departure from Caldwell Industries under controversial circumstances could complicate matters." Henry leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "I understand, but these girls mean everything to me. Whatever obstacles we face, I'm ready to tackle them." Ms. Lewis pulled out several newspaper clippings about the corporate scandal. "The court will scrutinize your background thoroughly. Judge Mills, who's likely to oversee this case, is particularly thorough when it comes to guardianship applications. As they discussed the legal requirements, Henry's phone buzzed with a text from Emma, asking how the meeting was going. A small smile crossed his face as he replied with a quick reassurance. "The good news," Ms. Lewis continued, "is that you have Aunt Clara Johnson's full support. That carries significant weight. However, the board's allegations about your mental state during your final months as CEO could be problematic." Henry straightened in his chair. "Those allegations were purely political. I have letters of support from community leaders, including Linda Morales from the community center. And the foundation's success speaks for itself." The legal process moved forward, but not without its challenges. During the initial hearing, Judge Rebecca Mills raised pointed questions about Henry's stability and commitment. "Your Honor," Ms. Lewis argued, presenting documentation of Henry's community work, "Mr. Caldwell's transformation isn't just personal, it's benefited the entire community. The Michael Caldwell Foundation has already provided educational support to dozens of children." Emma and Zoe sat in the courtroom, their faces reflecting both hope and anxiety. Aunt Clara Johnson testified about Henry's positive influence on the girls' lives, her voice steady and confident. "These girls lost their parents," she told the court. "Then they lost Michael, who was like a big brother to them. Henry has helped them heal, and he's become family to all of us." The community rallied behind them. Linda Morales spoke about Henry's dedication to the center. Even Dr. Alan Peters, who had performed Zoe's surgery, submitted a letter praising Henry's unwavering support during the medical crisis. Judge Mills reviewed all the evidence carefully, her expression neutral as she considered the unique circumstances of the case. Finally, after several tense moments, she looked up from her notes. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, "while your recent corporate history gave me pause, the overwhelming evidence of your commitment to these children and this community cannot be ignored. The court approves your petition for legal guardianship of Emma and Zoe Johnson." The girls' faces lit up with joy, and Aunt Clara Johnson wiped away tears. Henry sat still for a moment, overwhelmed by emotion, before standing to thank the judge. As they left the courthouse together, Emma and Zoe hugged Henry tightly. Ms. Lewis watched the scene with satisfaction, knowing she had helped forge a new family born of love, rather than blood. "Thank you," Henry said to Ms. Lewis, his voice thick with gratitude, "for believing in us and making this possible." The autumn sun warmed their faces as they descended the courthouse steps, now legally recognized as the family they had already become in their hearts. The moving truck pulled up to a modest two-story house on Maple Street, its white paint slightly faded but well-maintained. Henry Caldwell stood on the sidewalk, watching as movers carried in significantly fewer boxes than he'd originally packed. He'd sold or donated most of his expensive possessions, keeping only what truly mattered. "It's smaller than your old place," Emma observed, standing beside him with a box of kitchen supplies in her arms. Henry smiled, looking at the neighboring homes with their well-tended gardens and children's bicycles in the driveways. "It's perfect," he replied. Zoe darted past them, her energy fully restored after her surgery. "I call the room with the bay window," she shouted, her footsteps thundering up the wooden stairs inside. Throughout the morning, they worked together to arrange furniture and unpack boxes. In the living room, Henry carefully unwrapped family photos, some of Michael, others more recent ones of himself with Emma and Zoe. Emma arranged them on a simple wooden shelf, creating a timeline of their evolving family. "Where should we put Michael's trophies?" Zoe asked, holding one of her mentor's academic awards. "How about here?" Henry suggested, pointing to a built-in bookcase. "Right next to your science fair ribbon." The girls had brought items from their old home, too. Emma's hand-painted pottery pieces added splashes of color to the windowsills, while Zoe's collection of seashells found a home on the bathroom counter. Aunt Clara Johnson arrived with homemade curtains she'd sewn, their cheerful pattern brightening the kitchen windows. As afternoon turned to evening, neighbors began dropping by. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door brought over a casserole, while the Thompson family across the street arrived with fresh-baked cookies. The impromptu visits evolved into an informal block party, with folding chairs appearing on lawns and children playing tag between houses. Linda Morales showed up with several other community center regulars, carrying dishes of food and warm welcomes. The aroma of various home-cooked meals filled the air as neighbors shared their specialties, everything from soul food to traditional Hispanic dishes. Henry watched as Emma helped organize an impromptu buffet table on their front porch, directing traffic with natural grace. Zoe had already made friends with the neighborhood kids, her laughter mixing with theirs as they played. "This is quite different from your previous housewarming parties, I imagine," Aunt Clara said, joining Henry on the porch steps. "It's better," he replied, watching as more neighbors arrived, each bringing food, stories, and genuine warmth. "This is real." The evening air filled with conversation and music as someone brought out a portable speaker. Children danced on the lawn while adults chatted in groups, sharing neighborhood stories and advice about local schools and shops. Mrs. Eleanor Grant, who had insisted on remaining Henry's housekeeper despite the downsizing, moved through the crowd with a tray of lemonade, looking more relaxed than she ever had at the mansion. As the sun began to set, string lights twinkled to life across several porches, casting a warm glow over the gathering. The neighborhood had transformed their simple moving day into a celebration of welcome, acceptance, and new beginnings. Looking around at the diverse group of people who had come together to welcome his unconventional family, Henry felt a deep sense of belonging he'd never experienced in his previous life of wealth and isolation. This modest house on Maple Street, filled with love and surrounded by community, had already become more of a home than his mansion ever was. The Michael Caldwell Foundation's offices buzzed with activity as Henry reviewed the latest batch of scholarship applications. What had started as a small community initiative had blossomed into something far greater than he'd imagined. The foundation now supported educational programs across 3 states, with plans to expand further. "We've received twice as many applications this quarter," Linda Morales reported, spreading papers across his desk. The mentorship program is especially popular. Emma, now helping part-time at the foundation while attending college, entered with a stack of folders. "The art therapy program at Jefferson Middle School wants to thank you personally," she said, handing Henry a collection of student drawings. "They say it's changed everything." Zoe, who had become the foundation's unofficial youth ambassador despite her young age, pointed to a particular application. "This one reminds me of what Michael did for us," she said softly. The following week, they gathered at Riverside University, Michael's alma mater. The autumn air was crisp as students and faculty filled the courtyard. Henry stood at the podium, flanked by Emma and Zoe, facing an audience that included both academics and community members. Michael believed education was about more than books, Henry spoke, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. He saw it as a bridge between communities, a way to lift people up together. Emma stepped forward to announce the foundation's latest initiative, a full scholarship program specifically designed for students involved in community service. The crowd applauded as she shared stories of Michael's impact on her own education journey. Zoe, wearing a dress in her favorite shade of blue, proudly presented the first round of scholarship recipients. Each student's story echoed Michael's vision of education as a tool for positive change. The ceremony moved to the university's main hall, where local artists had spent weeks creating a massive mural. The artwork depicted Michael working with children from diverse backgrounds, surrounded by symbols of education, hope, and community unity. The lead artist, Maria Santos, explained the imagery to the gathered crowd. "We wanted to capture not just what Michael did, but what he inspired others to become," she said, gesturing to the vibrant scenes of learning and growth depicted in the mural. Henry stood before the mural, taking in every detail. The artists had perfectly captured Michael's gentle smile, the way he would lean in to listen to someone speaking, his habit of rolling up his sleeves before diving into any project. "It's exactly how I remember him," Zoe whispered, slipping her hand into Henry's. Emma touched a section of the mural showing a young girl reading to younger children. "That's what he taught us, that we all have something to give." Linda Morales gathered the artists and scholarship recipients for photos, the mural serving as a perfect backdrop. The foundation's logo, incorporated subtly into the design, reminded everyone that Michael's work continued through each person he had touched, The mural became an instant gathering spot, with students stopping to study its details and share stories. Some recognized themselves or their friends in the faces depicted, while others pointed out locations from their community center. As Henry watched people interact with the artwork, he realized that Michael's legacy had taken on a life of its own. Through the foundation, through art, through education, his son's vision of connecting communities and creating opportunities continued to grow and evolve. The morning dawned clear and crisp as Henry, Emma, and Zoe made their way through the cemetery's winding paths. Each carried a bundle of white roses, Michael's favorite. The grass sparkled with dew beneath their feet, and birds sang softly in the nearby trees. Henry held Zoe's hand as they approached Michael's headstone. The polished granite gleamed in the early sunlight, the inscription as clear as the day it was carved. Emma carried a small basket containing 3 stones they had painted together the night before, each decorated with messages of love and remembrance. Standing before the grave, Henry placed his roses first, arranging them carefully against the stone. His hands no longer trembled as they once had. The crushing weight of guilt and regret had gradually transformed into something gentler, a bittersweet appreciation for the son he'd finally come to know through the lives he'd touched. Emma stepped forward next, laying her flowers alongside Henry's. She touched the headstone briefly, the way she always did, as if greeting an old friend. Zoe followed, carefully positioning her roses and stepping back to stand between Henry and her sister. They stood in respectful silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The morning breeze rustled through the nearby trees, carrying the sweet scent of spring flowers. After a while, Henry cleared his throat softly. "I never understood you when you were here, Michael," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "But you've taught me more in death than I was willing to learn in life. Thank you for showing me what truly matters." Emma squeezed Henry's hand before speaking. "You believed in us when we needed it most," she said. "You showed us that our circumstances didn't define us. Because of you, I'm starting college next fall, something I never thought possible." Zoe stepped forward, her voice clear and strong despite her recent surgery. "Thank you for bringing us all together," she said simply. "I wish you could see how your dad takes care of us now. I think you'd be really proud of him." Henry's eyes welled up at her words, but his smile remained steady. Emma placed the painted stones at the base of the headstone, one from each of them. They formed a small triangle, symbols of their connected lives. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds. A gentle warmth touched their faces as they stood together, bound by love for the man who had changed all their lives. "Ready?" Henry asked softly, looking at both girls. Emma nodded, taking Zoe's hand. Henry took Zoe's other hand, and together they turned from the grave. As they walked toward the cemetery gates, their joined hands swung gently between them, a physical reminder of their connection. The horizon stretched before them, painted in soft blues and whites. Birds soared overhead, their wings catching the sunlight. The path ahead was clear and bright, much like their shared future. In that moment, as they walked together, they were more than just 3 people brought together by circumstance. They were family, bound by love, understanding, and the lasting legacy of Michael Caldwell. If you enjoyed the story of Emma and Michael, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.